There we go. Okay. So at this point, right, what we did was we UV unwrapped the pipes. And that did allow us to kind of show off, right? If I go to 3 for face mode, right? So I select the pipe object, 4 for object mode, 3 for face. That way you can actually see your UVs, because when you select an object, you'll often notice the UVs aren't there, right? You'll often notice the UVs aren't there. So what ends up happening is you have to select the faces to see the UVs, right? So they're there on the object. It's just you're not visually seeing them without faces being selected. So I usually, like I said, select the object, 3 for face mode, then Control A to select all. Remember those select alls right here, right? You'll notice there's a lot of wasted pixel space in here, right? Now, some of this can be fixed just by kind of maybe scaling this up a little bit. I don't know why that snap keeps being turned on. And moving them around, right? So you can always kind of scale them up a little bit. Keep in mind, though, that if you change them too much, like we saw on our previous video, it will change what we call textile density, right? And that's textile is short for texture element, right? It's kind of the shortened parts of those words combined. And textile density, generally, you want to be fairly one-to-one, right? Where each part gets roughly what pixel distribution it should get for its relative size, right? So if you scale something up too big, right, we start to see that it just gets a lot more pixels, a lot more squares than the rest of it, right? And that will show up on the model, right? This will look really nice and sharp, and these will look a little bit blurry or more pixelated. Now, if you look at a lot of older games, that's exactly what you'd see, right? Parts of the model that look nice and sharp and clean, and then parts that look low resolution. They did that out of necessity, right? Nowadays, we really try to keep the textile density closer to 1. But minor adjustments, right, where you're not radically changing the size, is not going to result in a noticeably different textile density, right? You notice how this still looks pretty similar to those? So don't be afraid of changing the size a little bit just to kind of maximize how many pixels go on something, right? That way you just get a little more of the pixels in the model and stuff like that. But you notice how it's not radically altering the distribution, right? Now, in this case, that's a lot of pixels wasted right here. At the end of the day, that's not wrong per se, but that is a lot of textures that you're not getting used, right? So oftentimes, it can be very, very useful to combine multiple objects, right? Combine multiple objects. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, save this. I'm going to go to 4 for object mode. And I'm going to go to my thrusters, right? Now, in this case, you see I do have a mirror modifier on them. So if I want, I could just go to the blue wrench and just get rid of that mirror modifier. If, for whatever reason, you don't have that mirror modifier, you just select half of them, delete, right? In this case, what I want to do is I want to, select this object, then shift left click this object, right? You select both. And then, of course, you can right-click, and there's a join feature, right? So if you right-click in object mode, right? So 4 for object mode. I left-click on the thrusters, then I shift left-click on the body. Right-click. There is an option for join. And that joins those together. Now, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that if I go down to the orange, orange, I keep saying that. Green, right? Not colorblind, it's green. This green triangle down here, as part of our properties editor, you'll now see that there are 2 UV maps on this, right? The pipes, but then if you kind of switch to the UV map, and of course 3 for that, Control A, you'll see the UVs for the thrusters. Now, technically you can, I'm trying to remember how to do it. I usually already have everything combined the way I want to, but I believe there's actually a way to combine these. But since I haven't UV unwrapped these thruster engines yet, it's kind of no real reason to, right? So what I could do is I could always just kind of, kind of hit X, or not X. You see how if you click on the camera here, it'll kind of turn one or the other off, right? And what I could do is with, like, say, pipes on, I could click on the UV map and then hit minus, and it gets rid of that, right? That then leaves us with a couple of things. One, I'm going to go back to object mode. And I'm going to go back to my little red sphere here. And I'm just going to make sure that material's on everything there. It should be because they're all combined, but never hurts to double check. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back in here to these thrusters, and I'm just going to start to make their own seams for them, right? So it's that kind of very normal process we've already gone through. In fact, I'm going to quickly probably just delete these top ones right here, right? Shift left click, delete faces. Just, we don't need those, right? They're inside the hole of the ship. So I can easily just, you know, left click, shift left click, shift left click. Delete on the keyboard, right? Faces. That just cleans this out a little bit. And then what we could do is we can go in here and we could kind of just UV unwrap these sections, right? And we saw this kind of as a part of review lecture, right? We just kind of shift double click this edge loop, shift double left click this edge loop, shift double left click this little edge loop inside there. That way kind of this unwraps into its own little island, this will unwrap into its own island, this one will unwrap into its own little island. That'll basically unwrap this cylinder into 3 parts, right? 3 UV islands, right? It's kind of like UV objects. But the cylinder parts, the sides, it's not enough to just have those as a part. You need to treat it like a label on a bottle, right? A label has at least 1 seam so that you can peel it off to make it a low distortion rectangle shape. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of shift, left click, some extra edges here. And then of course right click, mark seams. And so that's the basic seam pattern we'd use for these thrusters, right? Double left click, shift double left click, shift double left click. That allows this part to be its own, this part to be its own, this part to be its own, this part to be its own. But like we said, we need the actual parts that are the most cylindrical, right? That actually kind of wrap around like this. Whereas these are kind of more like flat, right? Those need their extra little seams. Think of a label on a bottle, water bottle, soda bottle, right? There's always a little seam so that you can pull that sticker off to get it back to its kind of initial rectangular sticker shape when it was 2-dimensional. So of course, right click, mark seam. And that's really what I'm just doing for these, right? I'm just going to add these seams in here. Right click, mark seam. And it's just that continued process of adding the seams where we want them to be. Right click, mark seam. Remember, right click brings up edge mode. Now, technically the UV Magic has a copy UV feature which would allow me to copy these on top. But I figure it's going to be nice to kind of give them all their own little unique textures. So we'll just kind of have them on their own on this one. There's lots of things I'm not showing you that Blender can do, right? That Blender can, it's a high school class. There's only so much we could do. Just trying to get some good fundamentals. All right, right click. Remember, right click brings up your edge context menu. Mark seam. And then, of course, I just go back here and I kind of do it to these back engines here. And you can see at this point, it's just the same edge loop patterns, right? And this is when these videos can always be great because you always have a visual reference for where I'm putting the seams at, right? But it really is trying to break this into a couple parts so it'll be low distortion. And particularly these extra seam here and the extra seam here kind of basically treats this like a label. So it can kind of be peeled off to be a rectangle shape. Mark seam. And so you can see it's just the same, right? Shift double left click. Right? Remember, shift always adds selections, whether it's a single edge or an edge loop or objects. Shift left click will add to selections. That actually will usually subtract, unless it's an edge loop. If you want to subtract an edge loop, it's control double left click. So occasionally in Blender, control will be deselect, but usually it'll be shift. But the nice thing is knowing control and shift do that, it's usually pretty easy to figure out which one, just through experimentation, right? But like tweak tool, circle select, they'll use control. Right click, mark seam. And you see how we can mark seams as we go? I'm just making sure to select some edges to make seams. Right click, brings up the edge context menu, mark seam. Remember, if you add too many or you do a wrong one that you don't want, you can clear it. You can often also undo, of course, Control Z. And that now has those all set up with seams. Now, remember, one of the things you could do if I go to 3 for face mode is I could go in here and I could really just kind of select some faces on each of those, right, those thrusters. Now, select linked would, of course, work, but you'll notice select linked in when you've got UV seams actually only selects the islands, which is actually kind of neat, but you have to be aware of that. So when you use select linked, right, and I've set mine to spacebar instead of default right bracket, it will only select the islands if you put seams on your model. And it's actually kind of cool that it does that. You just have to be aware of it. At this point now, I can always use the select more or less, right, up and down arrow. Those are default quick keys. Up and down arrow are default. These ones I added, right? If you go into this menu, you see next and previous active don't have default quick keys, but those are awesome tools, right? They kind of let you grow edge loops or face loops, but also can even consider which polygons or edges you skip. It's a really, really cool feature. But it works a lot like more or less. That's why I gave it shift up and down arrow. But more and less are default, right? Those are the actual stock quick keys. So just hit up arrow, and it will just grow or add to that selection more, right? And now with those selected, I should be able to go to UV, unwrap, and you notice how it unwrapped those into their own little parts, right? So you see, particularly since we didn't have those UV unwrapped, right? Technically, we were able to just kind of, get rid of the other UV map from the original object, make sure to only have like the pipes UV left, and that had the original stuff. And then I just set the seams up and unwrapped those by themselves. Now in this case, I'm going to go put my cursor in the UV editor. Control A will select all in the UV editor also, but you notice how they're kind of independent of each other, right? Remember, these aren't synced. If you have synced on, things like your straighten won't work, right? Usually you don't need synced on, but it is kind of cool that you have that, but it's also kind of cool you don't, right? So I'm going to scale these down. So R for scale, I'm going to scale them down. Move them over here for the moment. And if I move my cursor back over, because you notice how we're not seeing the pipes at all, that's because in the 3D view, they're not selected. So whichever viewport your cursor's over, that's what's going to be the active viewport. So I put my cursor back over the 3D view, Control A, and now you'll actually see those. Now, of course, I could select everything in here. I'm going to turn this to, and your Q will actually work, so your quick keys work the same in here. Q will cycle you through your different selection types. So I can just do rectangle select, move these over. And you see how it just takes up more space now? We could probably make it a little bit more in here. So maybe if I go to 4 for object, right? You see how it's kind of got all these little strips in there? If I wanted to, I could always scale those up a little bit. W for move, right? So you see how your move, rotate, scale work in here? And even though technically you have packing tools in here, right? So you notice you can actually come in here to pack UVs, right? If I go to Control A, select all, right? You see how the select menu has, the UV editor has its own select menu with a lot of those same tools, as well as some of its own unique ones, right? But with everything selected, if I go to UV, you can actually do things like pack islands. We'll just try to pack everything, but it does kind of resize stuff. So even though pack is not bad, sometimes I want kind of my own adjustments where I want to maybe make these a little bit bigger, right? So pack can be a good way to start these things off, but I often find myself kind of making my own little adjustments here. But it's up to you. If you had like a little bit of dead space down here, not a big deal, right? I'm just trying to show you that it's always a good idea to kind of try to take up a lot of the space that's in there, right? It's kind of not a bad idea. And you notice I'm doing minor size changes, right? They're not radically getting bigger. So it's not going to affect that textile density too much. So sometimes I do find myself doing a little bit of my own kind of manual packing just to kind of maximize things a little bit better. It's kind of up to you on how you want to kind of approach these. Maybe scale these up a little bit. Position. All right, and that's a bit better, right? I could probably pack this a little bit better than that, but you'll now see that because we made these all in one object, we're able to take up and not waste a bunch of pixel space, right? These are now all pixels that are properly going to be used, so we'll actually be able to use most of this texture. So sometimes you look for the option to combine objects together just to make sure that you don't have a lot of wasted texture space. And it's kind of cool to know you can join and re-UVunwrap or UVunwrap new parts that maybe you haven't UVunwrapped yet that have been added to the object. It's kind of cool to get to see that. And then, of course, we go to File for Object. I go to my blue wrench again, add modifier mirror. Of course, if you want to use your auto mirror plugin, you can, your add-on. In this case, it's applied over, so I can always just hit Apply All if you have the mod add-on on. Or you could just go to the little V right here and hit Apply. And that now gives us UVunwrapping for the engines and the thrusters. All right, I think that'll be a great place to stop for that.